I'm really excited to be here, or the facsimile for here for the past year, to talk to you about the pandemic, where we are, and where we think things might be headed over the next couple months. It's actually kind of fortuitous that we're having this event today of all days. Today is actually the 1-year anniversary of the WHO declaring COVID-19 as a pandemic. And just a few days later, on March 15th, 2020, Virginia would record the first of its nearly 10,000 deaths. And schools quaintly were preparing for a 2-week hiatus. As politicians and the public were just starting to hear the alarm bells scientists had been ringing for several weeks. That message finally started to break through a few days later when the Imperial College London put out a study forecasting how many people would get sick and die from COVID-19. They estimated there would be 2.2 million deaths in the US over 8 to 9 months if we continued to do nothing. That got people's attention. But the number was so big, it seemed impossible. It seemed alarmist. But it was a sober analysis based on rather simple math. The report warned that doing nothing ensured we would break our healthcare system. There would be too many people sick all going to the hospital at the same time. There wouldn't be enough medical staff, enough beds, enough medicines, or supplies. The report also looked at things we might be able to do to help slow the numbers of cases so hospitals could keep up with the sick and the dying. Converting regular rooms into new critical care spaces, closing schools, isolating cases, quarantining the most vulnerable populations. Each of these helped some, but none came close to where we needed to be to prevent the collapse of our healthcare system. So they proposed a radical idea, shutting down the economy, the whole world, for roughly 2 months. In what became known as the hammer and the dance, the idea was the initial total shutdown would quickly slow down the virus spread and get cases as close to zero as possible. It would also give governments and healthcare systems around the world the time to build up testing and tracing capacity so that when things open back up, new cases could be quickly identified, isolated, and hopefully the spread of the virus managed. The report recognized even this wouldn't eliminate the virus completely, but the strategy was, with robust testing and tracing, additional shutdowns would be smaller, more regional, helping governments to keep things under control. That was the dance. If the 2.2 million deaths were hard for policymakers to hear, they absolutely didn't want to hear the bitter medicine the Imperial College London report called for, but it got their attention. Within days of this report, the White House started doing its daily coronavirus task force press conferences. It was at these press conferences where Dr. Birx, Dr. Fauci, and others explained the U.S. approach, which was based on the hammer and the dance and became known as flatten the curve. They explained that starting in mid-March and through April, if we pitched a perfect game, we could keep total deaths in the United States under 240,000. And one by one, states started to enact shutdowns of varying degrees. But we never stayed locked down long enough, or more importantly, we didn't use the time to expand testing and tracing capacity high enough to be able to keep pace with the numbers of cases. We did the lockdown part of the hammer, but not enough of the rest of it. So instead of our case counts looking like this, they looked like this. This is what Virginia's numbers of daily new cases have looked like over the course of the pandemic, which is pretty similar to most other states. We did the lockdown part of the hammer, and the hospitals did the best they could to expand capacity, but we never really did the rest of it, so our numbers just kept going up. And the thing to keep in mind, the hammer and the dance were never meant to be the solution to the pandemic. They were recommendations on how to save the most number of lives and buy us time to make a vaccine. Because this thing isn't over until we have enough people who have immunity so the virus has nowhere to go and eventually dies out. Until then, people will keep getting infected and keep dying. It'll just take longer. So the vaccine is our shot to stop the dance. And scientists around the world have been working on this problem since late January 2020. According to the WHO, there are over 150 COVID-19 vaccines in development around the world, with these being the 12 that are the furthest along and already in use in various countries, including the 3 currently being used in the US, and the next 2 we expect to be applying for emergency use authorization in the US sometime this spring or early summer. So with 150 vaccines in production, the world's scientists are using every technology we know of to solve this problem. So far, we've actually been pretty lucky. Making vaccines isn't generally this easy. There are lots of diseases we've tried to make vaccines to, and several of them fail to work. So that's why so many companies are trying so many different approaches. We didn't know what would work, so we're trying everything we can think of. You can break vaccines down into 4 main groups. And somewhere in the world, someone is working on a vaccine based on each of these different approaches. Probably the oldest vaccine technology is the idea of finding a virus that's a milder version of the disease-causing virus. Something that doesn't really make people sick, but close enough that immunity to it will protect you from the real thing. We've used this approach to control lots of different important diseases. Smallpox, measles, mumps, rubella, and the chickenpox vaccines all use this approach. The issue here, however, is it's really hard to find a virus that's similar enough to the disease you're trying to prevent, but not so similar that it actually causes the disease. So it can take a long time to find the right strain of virus to use. There are just 2 COVID-19 vaccines that I'm aware of that are taking this approach, but they're still in early phase 1 trials, which means they're a ways off from being anything you'll hear about in the news, if they even make it that far. So another well-established approach is using just proteins from the virus. We can make these by growing up large amounts of the virus and then inactivating it so it can't make you sick. Or we can use other cells to produce some of the viral proteins. In either case, there are several effective vaccines that use this approach. The flu shot, the HPV vaccine, and the shingles vaccine all use this technology. Actually, the Novavax vaccine, that so far has some good results, but is still in the middle of their phase 3 study and probably won't be done for another 2 months, they're using this approach. The disadvantage of this type of vaccine is that it's really good at stimulating your body to make antibodies against the virus, but it doesn't really do a good job of stimulating the other major antivirus cells, your T cells. That's normally okay, but if the virus mutates and your antibodies don't work anymore, you don't have your T cells to provide any protection. So you'll need to develop a new vaccine. That's part of the issue with why we have to have a new flu shot each year. That's why over the past 30 years, we've been working to develop new vaccine technologies that activate all of your immune system the way the real infection would, or the way the weakened virus vaccine would, but that are faster to make. So one of these approaches is called the viral vectored vaccine. Here we take viruses that we know don't cause any disease in people, and we engineer them to express genes from other viruses. The Johnson & Johnson and the AstraZeneca vaccine are the 2 best known examples of those right now, and both use adenoviruses to deliver coronavirus immunity. This technology has been around for a long time, and there are several vaccines that have been in various stages of development. Actually, Johnson & Johnson used the same virus vector for an Ebola vaccine that's been approved for use in most of the world. So then the last approach involves the use of injecting genes for some of the viral proteins in the form of either RNA or DNA. This skips the need for finding a harmless virus to put these genes in, like with the last approach, so it makes it much faster for responding to situations like this. There have been lots of clinical trials for this technology, but now the Moderna and Pfizer COVID-19 vaccines are without question the most successful of this vaccine type. The issue with these vaccines, and the reason why you haven't heard of them before, is not because they're so new or because the technology is still experimental. It's because of business and market forces, not necessarily medical or biological reasons. As you've heard on the news, these vaccines need to be kept really cold, in freezers that cost around $15,000 each and only have a lifespan of around 5 to 10 years. If you're just talking about the shingles vaccine, no doctor or pharmacist is going to invest in these types of freezers, not when there's other vaccines that do a good job and don't require all this special equipment. You need a special circumstance to make that make sense. A global pandemic, where the government has essentially said, get it done and we'll cover the cost, now the market forces work in your favor and you can take advantage of the speed this production approach offers. But I can't stress enough how lucky we've been with these vaccines. I mean, our understanding of how to make vaccines has gotten a lot better, but still, so far, just about every vaccine we've tried in the US, Europe, Russia, China, India, all appear to be highly effective. If you remember back to when the campaign to make vaccines started, the threshold of effectiveness we were hoping for was just 50%. We now have 3 vaccines that appear to be nearly 100% effective at preventing hospitalizations and deaths. But it's really hard to compare these vaccines head to head. Each company tested their vaccines slightly differently, and the J&J vaccine was tested later in the year and in different countries, so it was challenged with different viruses. The South African strain, the UK strain, the Brazil strain didn't exist, or if they did, they were only minor players in the number of infections at the time the two mRNA vaccines were being tested. I know a lot of people look at the numbers of how effective these vaccines are at preventing mild disease and think, I don't want something that's just 57% effective. Focus on the fact that all of these keep you out of the hospital, and more importantly, keep you out of the ground. But vaccines have zero effectiveness sitting on a shelf. They need to be in people's arms. For us to start putting this pandemic behind us, we need to get people vaccinated. And we actually have some good news on that front. While we've seen survey results over the past several months suggesting that at best half of the public was planning to get vaccinated, now that the vaccines are here and people know others who've gotten vaccinated and they didn't develop gills or grow horns, we're seeing more people planning to get the vaccine than we were even just a few months ago. However, we still have work to do if we're going to get enough people vaccinated to start to control this virus. So what are the major reasons why people might not get the vaccine? Concerns about side effects, they felt the vaccines were rushed or produced too quickly, they want to know more about how well they work, they have general distrust of the medical system, or they don't think they need it, or they just don't get vaccines in general of any kind. Let's go through each of these some. First, regarding side effects. I'm not going to go into stats about how many people are experiencing sore arms or developing fevers after they got their shots. I'm not that kind of doctor, so it's probably best to leave those questions for Dr. Franks. But I can go into some more of the outlandish myths about side effects. The first one, that you can actually get COVID-19 from vaccine. I've seen reports that as many as 1 in 3 people believe this. Since we just went over the different vaccine technologies, you now know there's no live COVID-19 in any of these vaccines. So there's no way you can get COVID-19 from the vaccine. I think some people may be confusing the fact that some people experience a short fever, maybe some mild to moderate flu-like symptoms after getting the vaccine, but that's your immune system reacting to the vaccine, doing its job, not COVID-19. Another big one I hear is this rumor going around Facebook and social media saying that the vaccine will cause miscarriages or fertility issues because the protein that the vaccine targets has 4 amino acids in a row in common with the protein that plays a role in placental development. That's not true. First, if it was, everyone who got COVID-19 would have fertility issues, since the protein the vaccine targets is part of the coronavirus. Second, the immune system needs between 8 and 16 amino acids to recognize something, so 4 is just too short. And third, actually, when I first heard this rumor, my initial response was, only 4? That's pretty low. Proteins are made up of amino acids. There are 21 amino acids in humans. Given that all the proteins across all your cells are all made up of different combinations of just 21 different building blocks, there are bound to be lots of short regions where the same amino acid, 3 or 4 runs, show up linked together. So there's bound to be some short string of similarities between any two proteins just by chance. So going back to the list of reasons why people don't get the vaccine, the next one is the concern that these vaccines were rushed. When all you heard from March to November was it normally takes a decade to make vaccines, when they named the program Operation Warp Speed, and then we have a vaccine in 9 months, this is an entirely unreasonable concern for people to have. But let me try to explain why this shouldn't worry you. It normally takes years, maybe even a decade or more, to bring a vaccine to market, because making vaccines is expensive and biotech companies move very methodically to make sure they will recoup all of their development costs later. So at each stage of the process, there are lengthy discussions about progress, the strength of the data, if the project's on budget, if it's on time, has the market changed, what's it going to cost for the next phase of development, and where's that money going to come from? When you get into clinical trials, the FDA is generally slower as well, and companies are risk averse. So they're not going to invest in building the manufacturing capacity or hiring new staff to start producing millions of doses of a new product until they know they have approval. What Operation Warp Speed did was give companies money to start building manufacturing capacity It also gave them money and the permission to run some of the clinical trials at the same time. We didn't cut steps out. We figured out ways to do things at the same time instead of one after the other. But still, this perception that things happen too fast certainly wasn't helping with groups that just have general, and in many cases well-deserved, distrust of the medical establishment. But there's good news here too. Outreach seems to be working, especially to African American communities. You can see a major uptick in the number of people saying they plan to get the vaccine starting in December all the way through now. Actually, African Americans now have the highest level of interest in getting vaccinated. But there are still some who need convincing. We have the group that just wants to see more data about how they work, and we have the group that doesn't get vaccines or don't think they need this one. To borrow a concept from business and marketing, these people fit into what's known as the law of diffusion of innovation. Some people just don't like to be first. They need to see other people do it and not have a bad experience before they'll join in. I'm not concerned about these people. They'll come around. But it's the last group, the laggards, that we have to work on. Based on the latest surveys, the definitely won't and the probably won't groups make up about 30% of the population. We need to win over as many of these people as possible so we have the best chance of reaching herd immunity, especially since for now the vaccine is not approved for use in kids under 16. That's a considerable amount of the population not eligible for vaccination. So we need to get as many adults to do their part to get us to herd immunity so we can protect those who can't get the vaccine. But what is herd immunity? At its most simple, it's when enough people in a population are immune to a disease such that there aren't enough new victims for the virus to spread to, and an outbreak dies out before the virus has a chance to infect those who aren't vaccinated. So the herd protects the vulnerable. But what does that really mean? Let's look at a couple of simple cartoon examples. The population on the left has no immunity to COVID-19. The population on the right has 30% of the people have immunity, shown in the blue figures. And then someone in each population gets infected. With a disease like COVID-19, each infected person, on average, infects 3 new people. So roughly a week later, that one person has infected 3 people. And so on, and so on, and so on. But you'll notice that the virus spreads a little slower in the population on the right. But the take-home message here is that with just 30% of the population with immunity, the only people protected from the disease were those with immunity. But what if half the population had immunity? Let's compare 30% and 50%. We have our infected person introducing the virus to the 2 populations, and it spreads week by week to new susceptible people. And you'll notice with the higher immunity level, the virus spreads a little slower again. But just like before, only those who were vaccinated were protected, so still not herd immunity. It's hard to know exactly how many people it will take for us to achieve herd immunity, but most think it will be above 70%. So what does that look like? The infection starts with our patient 0, but there's only one person in the population in close contact to patient 0 who isn't already immune, and no susceptible people in close contact to that second person. So there's nowhere for the virus to go, and the outbreak flames out. So about 25% of the population who weren't vaccinated were still protected from the virus. There are always people in a population who can't get a vaccine for any number of reasons. Babies and little kids, cancer patients, organ transplant patients, the immunocompromised. Herd immunity helps us make sure we can protect them too. That's why vaccines are one of the greatest inventions of all human history. But you've likely heard a lot of people saying we don't need vaccines to get herd immunity. And on paper, that makes intuitive sense. Those that survive infection should have immunity, and so if enough people get sick and recover, at some point, we should end up with enough immunity that protects others. But 1, that approach condemns a lot of people to death. 2, that's not really how things work. There are lots of diseases we've successfully controlled or even eradicated using vaccines. Smallpox, polio, measles, mumps, rubella, chickenpox, tetanus, whooping cough, Hep A, Hep B, and so on and so on. But I really can't think of a single disease we've controlled from natural herd immunity. Bieber fever, maybe. The thing is, if herd immunity happened naturally, viruses would bring about their own extinction. That's not how nature works. That's not how natural selection works. Viruses spread at a rate and mutate at a rate so that there's always enough victims. And that's the other thing herd immunity will help protect us from, the emergence of new variants. Every one of those infected people is another opportunity for the virus to mutate. The more infected people you have, the more variants you're going to get, which means it's just a matter of time before one evolves that's different enough that can infect people who've already recovered or who have some level of immunity. So now that we have the vaccine, we're in a race to get enough people immunized before the virus changes so much that the vaccine doesn't work. Right now, there are 3 variants that we're the most concerned about. The first of these is B.1.1.7. That was first recognized in the UK. This one seems to be about 50 to 80% more infectious, maybe as much as 64% more deadly. It also has the ability to evade some, but not all antibodies. So some of the monoclonal antibody therapies, like the one President Trump got, might not work against this variant. So far, all data says the vaccines do work against this variant, which is good because it's pretty much everywhere in the US right now. The next variant we're worried about is B.1.351, which was first discovered in South Africa. Like the UK variant, it's more infectious, probably more deadly, but unlike the UK variant, it seems to be able to infect people who've already recovered from other variants of COVID-19. The good news, while the vaccine isn't as effective against this variant as it is others, it does offer some protection. Then the last of the 3 variants is B.1, which was first discovered in Brazil. Like the South African variant, the most troubling issue with this one is it seems to be able to infect people who've already recovered from earlier variants of COVID-19. And vaccines only provide partial immunity. However, we do have good news on the variant front, as all the companies who are working on vaccines are now working to develop strategies to help ensure protection against these variants and potential others. Whether those will be new vaccines, additional boosters of existing vaccines, or some combination, we don't know yet, but they're being worked on. So with the emergence of these variants and the several others that we're keeping an eye on, it makes it difficult to know exactly what the next several months might look like, or even a year or 2. But I'm optimistic that we're on our way out of this mess. The best way to keep this virus from mutating and spreading is to immunize people faster than it can spread. We're doing that now, at least in the developed countries. At some point, by early summer I hope, the developed countries need to start assisting poorer countries with their vaccine programs. We're a global economy, and this is a global disease. It doesn't do us any good to control it here for a while, only let it cook and boil over somewhere else. It'll find its way here again. This won't be completely over anywhere until it's under control everywhere. But assuming we do that, and assuming none of the variants prove to be more problematic than the ones we already know about right now, I expect that by midsummer, things will start to look like they used to. Shops and restaurants will be more or less at capacity, movie theaters will be open again, travel will be largely back. Some large indoor events still might be limited, but outdoor events will be back. How quickly this happens is up to us. If we open too quickly, we could be right back where we were in December or January, losing a 9/11's worth of Americans every day, and numb to the staggering numbers. Keep in mind, while case numbers are falling, we still have as many daily cases as we had in November, and we're still averaging about 1,700 deaths a day. The numbers are headed in the right direction, but it won't take much for them to shoot back up. I'm not saying we can't start to relax some restrictions, but we need to look at more than just daily new case numbers. These are the metrics I'm looking for. When we see these kinds of numbers, not just in one county or one state, but in neighboring states as well, and we have the systems in place to rapidly test and trace new cases, then we'll know it will be safe for schools and universities to open back up for in-person learning in the fall, and more importantly, let fans back to watch college football. But as excited as we all are to get back to the great parts of our lives we've been denied for the past year, friends and family, travel, the past year has also shined a bright light on aspects of our society that need improvement, modernizing, more recognition, education, healthcare, who's essential and how we treat them. So as we recover from the last year, I really hope we can also each do our part to make society more resistant and more resilient to shocks like this in the future. Because as bad as this past year has been, it could have been worse. Nature has given us several warning shots over the past 20 years, and there's no reason to think there won't be more to come. But in the meantime, continue to stay safe, keep wearing your mask, washing your hands, watching your distance, and the one that doesn't get enough attention, but I think is the most important, open a window, and hopefully we'll be able to see each other unmasked at a restaurant in the not too distant future.